This man's been in the news a lot lately. Voted the greatest Briton of all time at the turn of the century. Winston Churchill is an emblem of what so many British people love about their nation, its history and indeed its character. But last year he became public enemy number one for all those who instead detest Britain and want to rub its nose in the evils and misdeeds which supposedly make up its entire history. He's still there for now, but what last year's chaotic scene showed was that those who populate the cultural landscape of our country, those who set the terms of debate, prove themselves more than receptive to the people who want to humiliate Britain, to diminish it, perhaps even destroy it altogether. Self-loathing, because that's what this is, has become almost second nature to Britain now. We no longer even see it for what it is. We've become so used to it. Of course, self-examination and self-mockery are healthy, and Britain's always been pretty good at those things. But self-abnegation of the kind which this country has had over the past few decades is not healthy, and I would say utterly destructive and demoralizing. So, in the words of so many demonstrators over the past few years, I'd say that the time has come to stop the hate. Well, I'm here in Greenwich Park, at the top of the hill by the Royal Observatory. Fantastic view, as you can see, and we're overlooked by General Wharf up there. I've been here 100 times, as indeed, my parents did way back in the 1950s. Over there is the O2, which you might remember started off as the Millennium Dome. Now, Millennium Dome was about 50 years after the Festival of Britain, which came along just after the war during the very bleak post-war years and was an attempt to make Britain confident. It was a huge success. Thousands of people went to the South Bank in London to take part in it.
London's South Bank exhibition is ready to show the world what Britain can do. 100 years ago, our engineering triumphs amazed overseas visitors to the great exhibition, of which this is a model. Today, in the Dome of Discovery and the other structures, we show the most modern building wonders. Vast, light, airy units without supporting columns to waste space. We've done wonders since the war. Now we're blowing our own trumpet for a change.
But with the Millennium Dome, it was in a different story entirely. Something had changed in that past 50 years. Official Britain, at least, seemed to have lost its confidence. Nobody could decide what should go in the dome. As a result, it was a dismal failure. But what had actually happened during those 50 years?
And so there was this great movement, epitomised by the Festival of Britain, which was a looking to science and technology to create a new world for everybody. You had new plastics and new types of architecture. You had Suez, where Britain was exposed to the world as essentially no longer being a first-tier nation, let alone a great power, unable to conduct foreign policy on its own without the approval of America. And all that people saw on their television screens for the next 15, 20 years were members of the royal family, the Queen and British governors lowering Union flags around the world in different countries. That's what led Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State to Truman, to say Britain's lost an empire and has yet to find a role. That caused huge controversy at the time. I mean, a great dent to Britain's sense of pride.
After a century and a half of British rule, the Union Jack was being lowered for the last time on this island in the Indian Ocean. This was the moment they had waited for. To the roar of the huge crowd, a Mauritian policeman hoisted the flag of the new independent Mauritian nation.
Britain's confidence had been replaced by a narrative which was so self-critical, it seemed determined to undermine Britain's sense of itself.
The great mental shift that took place in this country in terms of having a positive attitude towards the achievements of this country, the legacy of this country, and a sense that this country has had a beneficial impact on the world, really occurred in the 1960s, which was a cultural revolution of the most profound type. People don't seem to understand and realize that you can have a revolution without flying red flags from the rooftops and wearing communist uniforms. The buildings may still be standing there, but the people who are teaching in those teaching colleges, the people who are occupying the corridors of the BBC and of the civil service are not the same people who actually built those buildings.
The narrative of confidence in Britain was replaced by one such criticism that it really seemed designed to undermine Britain. Of course, long before the Festival of Britain, left-wing circles had never been known for their sense of patriotism. As George Orwell famously wrote, "England is perhaps the only great country whose intellectuals are ashamed of their own nationality." In left-wing circles, it is always felt that there is something slightly disgraceful in being an Englishman, and that it is a duty to snigger at every institution. Any English intellectual would feel more ashamed of standing to attention during God Save the King than from stealing from a poor box.
This is the rot at the core of this idea of self-hatred. The teacher training colleges spewed out generation after generation of extreme left-wing ideology, indoctrinating their teachers, who then indoctrinated their children. And that's why today fewer than 10% of our teaching establishment vote Conservative, for example. And of course the old adage has always been, give me a boy until he's 7 and I will show you the man. We are giving our children to schools from the age of 5 to 18 and then to university till 21, by which point you have a fully fledged, indoctrinated adult.
That's still true, of course, only more so. What was once just restricted to left-wing intellectual circles really expanded in the post-war years, especially with the growth of university education and indeed the emergence of the new left in the 1960s. Love of country was definitely out, and criticism was the order of the day. What it meant was that the nation state itself became deeply unfashionable, the font of all evil, and the British nation state in particular. Instead, what we were meant to be was this rather amorphous, meaningless thing, citizens of the world. I vividly remember an incident from a few years ago which really illustrated the all too predictable knee-jerk reaction to Britain and its history that was around. I was in a bookshop and in a queue at the counter, and the two guys serving behind were obviously having some form of discussion about Britain or British history. And one said rather snarkily, "Anyway, what has Britain ever given the world? Oh yeah, concentration camps." There was a kind of embarrassed silence in the queue. Nobody said anything. But really, what it did illustrate was part of what the late philosopher Sir Roger Scruton called the culture of repudiation. Nothing good could ever have come out of Britain.
The culture of repudiation, as I understand it, I think is a desire to repudiate everything worthwhile that has, the heritage of the West, every institution, and every tradition. I don't think anything has been left untouched, and particularly they've seized the means of cultural production. So in our television, in our museums, all of the key institutions, whether it was something that is, we talk about Antonio Gramsci's march through the institutions, whether or not that is something that was intentionally done, or whether it is just something that almost by, sorry for misappropriating Adam Smith here, but by a sort of Gramsciite invisible hand, just permeated through all of the aspects of our different aspects of our institutions. I think it's affected our culture in a really profound way, and has sort of taken the soul out of everything, to the point now where I don't think that there's really even anything left, even in the churches, you know.
We saw this with the Brexit campaign. The author, David Goodhart, subsequently identified two groups, the somewheres and the anywheres. The somewheres were people who were much more wedded to their locality, to a sense of place, to their families, and to the country indeed. Anywheres were people who saw themselves in a much more international context. Of course, it would be wrong to say that all Remainers were unpatriotic, because of course they weren't. But there was certainly a section for whom Britain was small, irrelevant, wouldn't be able to fend for itself. Those are the people that looked to the EU as our saviour, and indeed thought that we were going to be pretty much doomed on our own.
But I think that there is a definite distinction to be made between the people who voted Leave because they have a love of home and confidence in England, and that confidence that England could make something of itself outside of the European Union, versus people who just wanted to at first bash England and England's ability, or Britain's ability to survive outside of the EU.
This attitude was held by, shall we say, the more vocal sections of the Remain campaign and its supporters. In fact, one particular quote from the actress Emma Thompson very nicely sums up their attitude.
A tiny little cloud-bolted, rainy corner of sort of Europe, a cake-filled, misery-laden, grey old island.
She's entitled to her opinion, of course, but really, does there have to be such contempt dripping from every word? Of course, there were other things that happened in Britain in the years after the Festival of Britain. First of all, we had historically unprecedented levels of immigration, which resulted in the doctrine of multiculturalism. This might have been well-meaning for many people, but it was very hard to escape the conclusion that the one culture which shouldn't be celebrated was Britain's.
But it is this feeling that, you know, it is perfectly fine for the Celtic nations within the United Kingdom to celebrate their national heritage, to fly their flag proudly, but when an Englishman does it, he's seen to be a racist or a far-right thug. Britain should have remained a unitary state, and what Tony Blair did, in my view, was the most dangerous act of any Prime Minister of the 20th or 21st centuries. The decision to give Scotland and Wales their own legislatures and not to give it to England has been the single greatest source of discontent in terms of the cohabitation of those four powers within the United Kingdom. Indeed, in Wales, if you remember, there had never been a really strong nationalist movement. When the referendum was held there was low voter turnout, and the margin that voted in favour of having its own assembly was a tiny percentage. Since then, the appetite for independence and nationalism has surged in Wales.
Well, with all our institutions and indeed our metropolitan elites filled with shame and guilt about Britain, or indeed, in fact, sometimes it seems not even liking it very much, it is remarkable, actually, how pride and belief in Britain remains very strong amongst the majority of people. We see this, for example, with royal events. The media tends to suggest that these are going to be flops, that no one really cares anymore. And just take the Diamond Jubilee back in 2012, where they said it would be a damn squib. And in fact, people came out in their thousands and there were street parties up and down Britain. But also, you only have to look at opinion polls. So the most recent one showed that nearly 70% of British people actually felt very proud or fairly proud of Britain and its history. And if you look last year, and you probably know this is a very famous event, there was an attempt by the BBC to get rid of the traditional patriotic songs that are played at the last night of the proms every year. Land of Hope and Glory, Jerusalem. Only 5% of people actually agreed with the BBC that they should get rid of the songs entirely. So it put it firmly in its place. What we are seeing, of course, over the past few years is this attempt to rewrite British history almost totally in terms of empire and colonisation. Of course, there's a hell of a lot more to British history than that. But this is the obsession now in our academic spheres and in our institutions. So it's interesting to see that 4 out of 5 people, when they were asked recently, didn't feel that we should be very ashamed of our empire. They just saw it as part of our history, a fact of life, a fact of history. What's interesting as well about the empire is that actually the majority of people, I would suggest, don't have a very, very strong attachment to that part of British history. It was always more of a middle class interest and an upper middle class interest in the empire.
Far from the decolonising the curriculum lobby, far from the way they understand our curriculum, if anything, we fail to teach the horrors that are distinct to other countries. You know, China's history is absolutely horrific. China have never had a leader that they deserved. In the Middle East, I mean, the Ottoman Empire, the Barbary slave trade, there's so much history that is gruesome and awful and grisly, but we only focus on the things that are horrifically ours, right? So I think that is something that I realised, yeah, when I went to university, looking back on my education, that we really have a very skewed understanding of how uniquely awful we are in history, because we're not that bad.
I think for the majority of people, certainly for ordinary people, if there is a piece of mythology in Britain, its history, which still dominates the public mind without question, it would be the Second World War and the fight against Hitler and fascism.
This was the British people's finest day, the end of the German war. Throughout the country, at homes and at work, a nation exploded with spontaneous rejoicing for a great and wonderful deliverance. War scarred the face of Britain, but nothing ever sapped or changed the character of our people. The great news ran through the land. Manchester, Glasgow, Cardiff, Birmingham, London, in every town and village, big and small. And the true quality of Britain was seen in the manner of our rejoicing. Out came the flags. Nationwide was the celebration. For children, so many of whom have known nothing else but war, this day must have seemed like an entry into Never Never Land. Even the soberest overflowed, and not a few flowed over. 6 long years. A man we seem to have seen before somewhere looks down from a balcony in Whitehall.
Which brings us back to this fellow. I wonder what Winston Churchill, or George Orwell for that matter, would have made of the decimation of our memorials up and down the country last year, or indeed the attacks on British history which happened throughout our institutions. Whatever people think of him now, there's no question that admiration of Churchill was not necessarily a right or a left-wing thing in the past. The left-leaning historian A.G.P. Taylor famously described Churchill as the saviour of his country. But what about our political parties? What would Churchill think of the way they've responded to what has been a massive and ongoing cultural onslaught? Well, I can't help but feel he'd be very disappointed in the Conservative Party. It seems to have ceded most ground now on cultural issues to the left and is extraordinarily timid in its defence of Britain's heritage and its history. Similarly with Labour, which is now trying to wrap itself in the Union flag and prove that it's a patriotic party, and in the process fooling nobody. Back in 1974, just after the statue had been unveiled, my parents brought me to see it. It was a big national thing, really, a new statue of Churchill to mark his centenary of his birth. My parents at the time were Labour voters, but they were also extraordinarily patriotic people, and it wouldn't have occurred to them that Labour was anything but that. This was still the era of Harold Wilson and James Callaghan. I also wonder, along with Churchill and George Orwell, I also wonder what my parents would have thought of what's been happening over the past year. If most of our institutions now are slaves to guilt and shame about our history, there are things that we ourselves can do. First of all, it always used to be said that the British don't do flags. Certainly the government has suddenly realised that in fact the flag's pretty important, so it's going to be flying now from all public buildings all year round. But we ourselves as well must celebrate our national emblem and not be embarrassed. We should do flags. And if our teachers and museum curators and our charities, if they all recoil from our history, then it's up to us to make sure, like now, never before, that we know our history. It's up to us, therefore, to make sure that our children and our grandchildren know that history and what is great about it. It's up to us to make sure that they know about all the great things that Britain has given the world, so that when we are in a bookshop again with those boys like I mentioned earlier, there's not an embarrassed silence. We have got to make sure that the generations coming after us know about the great things that we gave to the world. So I make no apologies for listing some of those things right now, and neither should you.
Parliamentary democracy. The world's first industrial revolution. Charles Darwin and the concept of evolution. William Shakespeare. Isaac Newton and the laws of gravity. The World Wide Web as invented by Tim Berners-Lee. English, the global language. The concept of common law. The King James Bible. The scientific method as developed by Sir Francis Bacon. Sir Francis Drake. Joseph Lister. Alexander Fleming and penicillin. The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Charlie Chaplin. Turner. Cartwright and the invention of power looms. The mass production of steel. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Football, cricket, rugby, golf, almost all organised sport. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, William Harvey and the Human Circulation System, James Bond, the invention of Ian Fleming, Frank Whittle and the jet engine, Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, The Smallpox Vaccination by Edward Jenner, The Steam Engine, John Milton's Paradise Lost, The Cat Scanner, Harry Potter, as created by J.K. Rowling, The Structure of DNA, as discovered by Francis Crick and James Watson, Sherlock Holmes, the creation of Arthur Conan Doyle, the world's first modern postal service, Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot, the creations of Agatha Christie, The Beatles, Sir Alfred Hitchcock, the music of Edward Elgar, Charles Dickens, David Bowie, 1984 by George Orwell, electromagnetism developed by Michael Faraday, railways, Viagra, Florence Nightingale and modern nursing, the abolition of the slave trade, and Sir Winston Churchill.